In this video, I'll very briefly tell you how to use the different form of x's. So really there are only two different uses for x's in Venn diagrams. The first is for a particular premise, or a premise that is particular versus universal. Not just for a specific premise, but for a premise containing an O or I statement. And two, the X with the circle is used not for particular statements, but when an entire circle is shaded except for one part. Now, usually that designates an Aristotelian Venn diagram, and you can see the explanation for the circled X is on pages 276 and 277 in your textbook. What they show is an example about reptiles and scaly animals. So we'll do the second example first, because you've already seen in other videos how x's are used for a particular premise. So if we started off with the argument, all reptiles are scaly animals, all currently living tyrannosaurs are reptiles. Therefore, some currently living tyrannosaurs are scaly. Now again, I haven't shown you very many examples on these YouTube videos of arguments in which you have to determine where the conclusion is, but just remember that always. Here, it's very obvious. You've got your two premises here, and then the conclusion indicator therefore tells you that this is the conclusion. So we'll just symbolize our terms. We'll use R for reptiles, scaly animals A, T for currently living tyrannosaurs, so that we end up with all R or S, or all R or A. It's S in your book if you want to look at that example. I'm on page 276. All T are R, therefore some T are A. If we do a Venn diagram here, I'm going to slide this up so you can see. If we do a Venn diagram here, we notice that, again, some indications that we're dealing with an Aristotelian Venn diagram are, one, that you've got two universal premises, because you'll always need an entire circle that's shaded except for one area in a Venn diagram that's Aristotelian. And two, if you see some term like currently living tyrannosaur that doesn't exist or has empty extension. So I know this is my major term and my minor term. I know this is my middle term. It is, in fact, incorrect standard form, but if it wasn't, I would have to put the premise containing the major term first from top to bottom, then the premise containing the minor term, and then the conclusion. So we know that the figure is AAI1. And again, we'll use that as we have been to check our answer. So I'm going to put my middle term here, minor term here, major term here, and middle term here. So what I want to do is I want to do the Venn diagram like normal. If I want to say all R are A, I'm going to shade out all the parts of R that don't overlap with A. Then when I do all T are R, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the larger part of T and I'm going to shade it in entirely. Again, ignoring those third circles, dealing only with the two circles at different times. And what I see is that T is entirely shaded except for one area. If I just look at the T circle, then it's divided into part 2, 3, 5, and 6. All of those are shaded except for part 3. So part 3 is where we put our X with the circle. Because the X with the circle doesn't have anything to do with a particular statement, it's just an X marks the spot. I really wish that someone would have traditionally come up with some better way to indicate that, because it does get confusing between X's and X's with circles around them. But you're just going to want to put an X with a circle around any space. You're going to want to put that symbol in any space where there is an entire term that's shaded in except for one part. You'll notice that that happened a lot on your Venn diagram workshop, and even if it wasn't Aristotelian, you'll still need to put that little X. Now, what that indicates is that this is the term that we need to pay attention to, or as your book puts it, the term in question. And it makes it easier to read Venn diagrams without using our mood and figure, because we just want to say, okay, well, if this is the term in question, then it's going to be the one that has to exist in order for it to be conditionally valid for Aristotle. In addition to that, you'll see, and there was one like this, I think it was number 4 maybe, on your Venn diagram workshop that was very similar. But you'll notice that when we look up AAI1, which is the figure, when we look it up on our charts, which I've written out here, this is the little study guide that I'm always mentioning and showing to all of you. When I look it up on these charts, AAI1, I see that it's not under the unconditionally valid forms. It is under the conditionally valid forms, and if I look across, I see that the required condition for AAI figure 1 is that S exists. Now remember, S stands for the minor term, M stands for the middle term, and P stands for the major term. So they're telling you that the minor term must exist in your argument if it's figure AAI1. Well, guess what? The minor term is the same term. It matches up. It always will. If it doesn't, there's something wrong. It matches up with this term here. This minor term is also the term in question. And because T in the original argument was currently living tyrannosaurs. Tyrannosaurs did exist, but they don't currently exist. Tyrannosaurs, as far as I know, are extinct. So there are no currently living tyrannosaurs. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, this was the term in question. I can read this Venn diagram very easily. I know not only from AAI1 and my charts that it's going to be conditionally valid only on the condition that T, or the minor term, exists. And guess what? It doesn't exist. It stands for currently living tyrannosaurs. So this one would be invalid from both perspectives. And even though I've done a video very similar to this where there's an Aristotelian Venn diagram, I wanted to reiterate the use of this X with a circle around it. If this term had been in an unconditionally valid form chart, with the mood and figure, that's fine. It just means that you didn't need to look at that particular term from the Aristotelian perspective. But if your mood and figure is in the conditionally valid forms chart and your diagram shows that you've got one circle that's entirely shaded except for one part, then you know that wherever that X is that you've put, that's your term in question from the Aristotelian perspective. So you would still mark it for unconditionally valid forms, but you don't need to use it for those. You would only really use it when you are doing a conditionally valid forms. And if this term, again, had been anything but something that doesn't exist, if it had been, I don't know, trees or anything else like that that exists, then this would have been conditionally valid.